My husband's mother submerged our daughter in ice water, saying, "Strong hearts adapt to cold." The scream that tore from my throat echoed off the bathroom tiles as I watched Margaret hold my 3-month-old daughter Lily face down in a steel basin filled with ice water. Lily's tiny body went rigid with shock, her arms flailing weakly as the frigid water covered her head completely. "What are you doing?" I lunged forward, but Margaret's iron grip kept Lily submerged for another terrifying second before lifting her out. My daughter's lips were blue, her eyes rolled back, no sound coming from her open mouth. Margaret held Lily by her ankles, water streaming from her nose and mouth like some grotesque baptism. "Cardiovascular conditioning," she said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "Strong hearts adapt to cold. Weak ones fail early. Better to know now." I snatched Lily from her grandmother's hands, pressing my mouth over her tiny nose and lips, breathing warm air into her lungs. "Come on, baby, come on." Lily coughed once, then let out a weak cry that was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. "You're overreacting, Catherine," Margaret said, wiping her hands on a towel. "I trained combat medics for 20 years. I know what the human body can endure." She spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. My husband David appeared in the doorway, drawn by my screams. His eyes took in the scene, me clutching our blue-lipped daughter, his mother standing calmly beside a basin of ice water, my face streaked with tears and terror. "Mom, what happened?" David asked, but his tone was more curious than alarmed. He'd grown up with Margaret's unconventional methods, her military precision applied to child rearing. To him, this was probably just another of her training exercises. "I was conditioning Lily's cardiovascular system," Margaret explained, her voice taking on that patient tone she used when explaining things to civilians. "Cold water immersion strengthens the heart muscle, improves circulation, builds resilience." David nodded like this made perfect sense. "Mom did that with me when I was little. It's why I never got sick. Why I could hold my breath underwater longer than other kids." He looked at me with mild concern. "Catherine, you're shaking." I stared at my husband in disbelief. His mother had just held our baby underwater until she turned blue, and he was defending it as beneficial training. The man I'd married, the father of my child, saw nothing wrong with what had just happened. "She nearly drowned," I whispered, clutching Lily closer. She stopped breathing. Margaret made a dismissive sound. "She was never in real danger. I was monitoring her vital signs the entire time. 60 seconds of controlled cold exposure builds neural pathways that will serve her throughout life." She pulled out a waterproof stopwatch showing me the display. I timed it precisely. Professional athletes train this way. Navy SEALs use similar conditioning methods. I'm giving Lily advantages most children never receive. Margaret opened her duffel bag and produced a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting and charts. "I've documented every training session with detailed observations. Heart rate recovery, skin temperature changes, muscular responses. This is scientific methodology, not random cruelty." She showed me graphs tracking various metrics over multiple sessions. When had there been multiple sessions? This was the first time I'd witnessed Margaret's ice water training, but these charts suggested she'd been conducting experiments on Lily for weeks. "You've been doing this behind my back," I said, my voice barely controlled. Margaret's expression remained clinical, professional. "David gave me permission to begin conditioning while you were recovering from postpartum depression. He was concerned about your emotional instability affecting Lily's development." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My husband had authorized his mother to experiment on our daughter without my knowledge or consent, then hidden it from me while I struggled with the normal exhaustion of new motherhood. Over the next few days, I researched everything I could find about cold water training for infants. Nothing I discovered supported Margaret's claims about cardiovascular benefits. Instead, I found warnings about hypothermia, cardiac arrest, and brain damage from oxygen deprivation. When I showed David the medical articles, he dismissed them. Academic theories from people who've never been in real survival situations. Mom saved lives in Afghanistan using field medicine they don't teach in textbooks. Margaret arrived every morning at 8 sharp, carrying a military-style duffel bag filled with training equipment. Ice packs, timers, resistance bands sized for infants. Even what looked like miniature weights, she'd transformed our nursery into her own private laboratory. "Today we're working on grip strength," she announced, attaching tiny weights to Lily's wrists. "Weak grip indicates weak will. We'll start with quarter-ounce increments. Build up gradually." I watched in horror as she suspended my daughter from a modified mobile, forcing Lily to support her own weight, while Margaret timed the exercise with military precision. When Lily's grip failed and she fell crying onto the changing pad, Margaret made notes in a leather journal. "Day 3, grip failure at 12 seconds. Improvement needed." She wrote with the detached clinical tone of a scientist recording data. "We'll increase frequency, extend duration tomorrow." The training sessions became increasingly elaborate. Margaret had constructed what she called environmental conditioning chambers in our basement, areas where she could control temperature, humidity, oxygen levels, and sensory input. She explained each modification with technical precision that made it sound legitimate. "Hypoxic conditioning strengthens lung capacity," she said, showing me a clear plastic container with ventilation controls. "Athletes train at altitude to achieve similar effects. I'm simply creating controlled altitude simulation for infant development." David found me crying in the kitchen that evening. "Catherine, what's wrong? Mom's training is working. Look how much stronger Lily's getting." He showed me photos on his phone. Lily gripping objects, supporting her head earlier than expected, reaching for toys with improved coordination. "She's 3 months old," I sobbed. "She should be sleeping and eating and being held. Not undergoing military training. David's face hardened. My mother knows what she's doing. She turned weak recruits into warriors. She's giving our daughter skills that could save her life someday. That night, I called my pediatrician. Dr. Foster listened to my description of Margaret's training methods with growing alarm. This sounds like systematic abuse disguised as fitness. Bring Lily in tomorrow. I need to document any injuries. The examination revealed bruising on Lily's wrists from the weights, mild frostbite on her fingertips from ice exposure, and elevated stress hormones that indicated chronic trauma. Dr. Foster took photographs and filed a report with Child Protective Services. When I told David about the appointment, he exploded. You called CPS on my mother? She's trying to help our daughter, and you're treating her like a criminal. Margaret's response was more calculated. She arrived the next morning with a briefcase full of documentation, training manuals, certification documents, testimonials from former students praising her methods. Everything looked official and professional. Some people can't appreciate advanced training techniques, she told David while I listened from the kitchen. Your wife lacks the background to understand what I'm doing. She sees only surface appearances, not the profound benefits. The documentation Margaret presented was impressive and disturbing. Military commendations for innovative training programs, academic papers she'd co-authored on stress adaptation in combat personnel, letters from high-ranking officers praising her contributions to soldier readiness and survival rates. But buried within the official records were hints of controversy, mention of ethical review boards and protocol modifications, references to incident reports and medical interventions that suggested her methods hadn't always been successful. The CPS caseworker, Janet Morrison, seemed initially impressed by Margaret's credentials. Former Army medic, survival training instructor, multiple commendations for service. Margaret presented her case with military precision, explaining each training method in technical terms that sounded authoritative. Mrs. Thornfield is applying proven techniques adapted for infant development, Margaret told Janet, showing her the modified equipment. Everything is carefully calibrated for safety. The apparent distress Catherine describes is actually positive stress adaptation. Janet asked to see Margaret's training logs. The leather journal contained detailed records of every session. Temperatures, durations, Lily's responses, measurable improvements in strength and coordination. It looked like legitimate scientific research. Margaret had prepared for this meeting carefully. She'd brought video recordings of training sessions that showed only the successful moments. Lily gripping bars, supporting her weight, responding to commands. The footage was edited to remove any signs of distress or failure. As you can see, Margaret explained, the subject shows marked improvement in physical development. Muscle tone, reflexes, and coordination all exceed normal parameters for her age group. These are objective measurements of enhanced capability. That evening, I searched online for information about Margaret's military service. What I found made my blood run cold. Articles from military newspapers about a training incident at Fort Benning in 2018, several recruits hospitalized after extreme cold weather exercises, an investigation into unauthorized training methods. I dug deeper, using databases David had shown me for his journalism work. Margaret's discharge papers were publicly available through a Freedom of Information Act request, honorable discharge, but with notations about experimental training protocols and disciplinary action recommended. The incident report was damning. Margaret had subjected recruits to increasingly extreme cold exposure exercises, believing it would create superior soldiers. 3 men suffered hypothermia severe enough to require intensive care. 1 nearly died from cardiac arrest brought on by cold shock. She was trying to create super soldiers, the investigating officer had written. Her methods went beyond approved training parameters. She showed no recognition that her experiments were causing serious harm. The report detailed Margaret's philosophy in her own words, transcribed from disciplinary hearings. She believed that most military training was too soft, that only extreme stress could reveal and develop true human potential. She spoke about genetic superiority and the need to eliminate weakness from the gene pool. When I showed David the documents, he read them twice before setting them down with shaking hands. This can't be right. Mom said she was promoted for innovative training techniques. She was discharged because she nearly killed people, I said. And now she's doing the same things to our daughter. David stared at the papers for a long time. She said the weak recruits couldn't handle proper training, that she was weeding out the unfit. The words echoed strangely in our kitchen. I'd heard Margaret use similar language about Lily, about identifying genetic potential and eliminating weakness. The connection between her military experiments and infant training was becoming terrifyingly clear. The next morning, Margaret noticed my changed attitude immediately. You've been researching my background, she said, not making it a question. Found those reports from Fort Benning, didn't you? I didn't deny it. You experimented on soldiers? You nearly killed them. Margaret's expression didn't change. I was developing techniques to save lives in extreme conditions. Sometimes breakthrough science looks harsh to civilian observers. Those soldiers who completed my training performed better in combat than their soft-trained peers. She opened her journal to a new section I hadn't seen before. Photographs of children. David as a baby, his sister Rachel, his brother Michael. All showed signs of the same training I was seeing with Lily. Ice baths, weight training, endurance exercises. Your husband survived because I prepared him for a harsh world, Margaret continued. Rachel didn't make it through the full program. She was too sensitive, couldn't handle the conditioning. But look how strong David became. The photos were disturbing evidence of decades of systematic abuse. Baby David suspended from bars, his face red with exertion. Rachel crying in an ice bath, maybe 18 months old. Michael's tiny hands gripping weights while Margaret timed the exercise. But there were other children too, faces I didn't recognize. Margaret's journal contained records of training sessions with neighborhood children, the kids of military families, even infants she'd worked with in professional capacities. The scope of her experiments was far broader than I'd imagined. "Where is Rachel now?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Margaret's face showed the first crack in her composure. "Developmental delays. Lives in a care facility. The training revealed weaknesses that would have emerged anyway. Better to know early what you're working with." She turned the page to show me more recent photos. Rachel as an adult, clearly disabled, living in what looked like an institutional setting. Margaret had documented her daughter's decline with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything else. That afternoon, I drove to Sunny Meadows Care Center, where I found Rachel Thornfield in the activities room. She was 32 years old, but had the mental capacity of a 6-year-old, the result of brain damage from repeated oxygen deprivation during Margaret's training. She was a normal baby, the facility director told me, but she suffered what appears to be repeated hypoxic episodes before age 2. The family claims she was born with developmental issues, but the pattern of damage suggests environmental causes. Rachel smiled when I introduced myself as David's wife. "David is my brother," she said proudly. "He's very strong. Mommy made him strong with special exercises." I spent an hour with Rachel, listening to fragmented memories of Margaret's training. Ice water that made her sleepy. Exercises that hurt but were good for her. The gradual realization that something was wrong with her mind, that the other children could do things she couldn't. The facility director showed me Rachel's medical records, with permission from the family guardian. The pattern of injuries was consistent with systematic abuse, multiple incidents of hypothermia, oxygen deprivation, physical trauma disguised as accidents or genetic conditions. "We see this sometimes with military families," she explained quietly. "Parents who apply combat training techniques to child rearing. The results are almost always tragic." That evening, David and I had the hardest conversation of our marriage. I showed him photos of Rachel, explained what the care facility director had told me, laid out the pattern of Margaret's training methods across decades. "She destroyed your sister's brain," I said, "and now she's doing the same thing to Lily." David broke down completely. "I remember Rachel being different after Mom's training, but I thought she was just weak, couldn't handle what I could handle. Mom said some children don't have the genetic potential for excellence." We tried calling Michael, David's younger brother who lived in Oregon. He'd cut contact with the family years earlier, officially because of career demands, but David suspected there were deeper reasons. When Michael finally answered, his voice was strained and cautious. "I wondered when you'd call about this," he said after David explained the situation. "I've been waiting 20 years for someone to figure out what Mom really was." Michael's story filled in terrible gaps in our understanding. He'd been subjected to Margaret's training until age 6, when a particularly brutal session left him hospitalized with severe hypothermia. The incident had been covered up as a swimming accident, but Michael remembered the truth. "She called it genetic testing," he said over speakerphone. "Said she was identifying which children had superior bloodlines. I failed her tests, so I was eliminated from the program and sent to live with relatives." The elimination hadn't been gentle. Margaret had orchestrated a series of accidents and behavioral incidents that convinced Child Services Michael was better off elsewhere. She'd poisoned his relationship with David, convinced everyone that Michael was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. David was her success story, Michael continued. The proof that her methods worked. She held him up as evidence while hiding the failures like Rachel and me. We agreed that Margaret could no longer be alone with Lily. But when David tried to set boundaries, his mother's response was swift and calculated. She called CPS herself, claiming that I was preventing beneficial medical treatment and showing signs of postpartum psychosis. "Catherine has been acting erratically since the birth," she told Janet Morrison. "Paranoid thoughts, hostile behavior toward family members trying to help. I'm concerned she might harm the baby during one of her episodes." Margaret had documented my behavior for weeks, creating a file of evidence that painted me as unstable. Photos of me crying during training sessions became proof of emotional instability. My research into her background became obsessive stalking. My protective instincts became pathological overattachment. Janet scheduled an emergency evaluation. Margaret had prepared carefully, providing documentation of my concerning behaviors. My calls to the pediatrician became obsessive medical shopping. My research into her background became paranoid stalking. My tears during training sessions became emotional instability. The psychologist who evaluated me was Dr. Richard Vaughn, a colleague of Margaret's from her military days. He asked leading questions designed to make me sound unstable, interpreted my protective instincts as pathological overattachment. "New mothers sometimes develop elaborate delusions about threats to their children," he explained to David. "Margaret's training methods are unconventional but scientifically sound. Catherine's rejection of proven techniques suggests underlying psychological issues. Dr. Vaughn's report recommended that I receive psychiatric treatment, and that Margaret be given expanded access to Lily to continue her beneficial training program. The evaluation was a masterpiece of professional manipulation, using my own words against me and twisting maternal instincts into pathology. I felt the system closing around me, Margaret's influence extending through professional networks built over decades. Every authority figure I turned to somehow knew her reputation, trusted her expertise, saw me as the problem. Desperate, I installed hidden cameras throughout our house. If I could document what Margaret was really doing, show the authorities the full scope of her methods, maybe someone would listen. The footage I captured over the next week was horrifying. Margaret wasn't just conducting training exercises. She was performing systematic torture disguised as scientific research ice baths that lasted until Lily lost consciousness, breathing exercises that involved partial suffocation, strength training that bordered on physical abuse. The cameras revealed training sessions that occurred when I was sleeping or out of the house. Margaret would arrive before dawn, conduct brutal conditioning exercises, then clean up all evidence before I awoke. She'd been systematically abusing Lily for months while maintaining the appearance of helpful grandmother visits. But worse were Margaret's private moments, when she thought no one was watching. She would hold Lily and whisper about genetic superiority, about eliminating weakness from the bloodline, about her duty to weed out inferior specimens. "Your mother was too soft," she told my unconscious daughter, "but I can fix the flawed genetics she gave you, make you worthy of our family name." The recordings captured Margaret's true philosophy in chilling detail. She spoke about creating a superior genetic line through selective conditioning and elimination. Children who failed her training weren't just weak. They were genetic mistakes that needed to be corrected. I realized I wasn't dealing with misguided training methods, or even sadistic abuse. Margaret was conducting eugenic experiments, using my daughter as a test subject in her twisted program to create genetically superior humans. The hidden journal I found in her bag confirmed my worst fears. Pages of notes about genetic optimization through stress selection. Charts tracking which family members had survived the protocol and which had been eliminated as genetically unfit. Rachel wasn't a training casualty. She was intentionally brain damaged because Margaret deemed her genetically inferior. Michael, David's other sibling, had failed the program at age 4 and been sent to live with relatives, officially because of behavioral problems, but actually because he didn't meet Margaret's standards. The journal contained records of other children Margaret had tested over the years, military families who'd trusted her expertise, neighborhood children whose parents thought she was providing beneficial training. The scope of her genetic selection program spanned decades and involved dozens of victims. Most disturbing were her success criteria. Children who died during training were recorded as genetic elimination, positive outcome. Those who survived but suffered permanent damage were partial failures requiring termination. Only children who completed the full protocol without visible damage were considered genetically viable. The final entry in the journal was about Lily. Subject shows promise but carries defective maternal genetics. Intensive conditioning required to overcome hereditary weakness. If unsuccessful, termination may be necessary to preserve family genetic integrity. I photographed every page, copied every video file, and prepared to run. Margaret wasn't training my daughter. She was deciding whether Lily deserved to live. But Margaret's network was more extensive than I'd realized. When I tried to book flights out of state, I discovered our credit cards had been frozen. Margaret had convinced David that I was having a psychotic break and might kidnap Lily. She'd used her connections to have me flagged as a flight risk. My car wouldn't start. Margaret had disabled the ignition system with the same technical precision she applied to everything else. My phone service was suspended after she convinced the provider that I was using the device to stalk and threaten family members. I was trapped in my own home, isolated from any help, while Margaret prepared for what she called the final evaluation phase of Lily's genetic testing. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Margaret arrived early the next morning and immediately noticed something different in my behavior. I was documenting everything with my phone, no longer trying to hide my recording. "You found my private notes," she said, not bothering to deny it. "Good. Now you understand the scope of what I'm doing." She moved between me and Lily's crib with military precision. David's father had excellent genetics, but his children showed disappointing variations. David succeeded because he had the mental strength to complete the program. Rachel and Michael were genetic dead ends. I backed toward the kitchen, keeping Lily clutched against my chest. "You brain-damaged your own grandchildren." Margaret followed me calmly. "I eliminated defective traits before they could propagate. It's basic evolutionary science. Only the strong survive to reproduce." She pulled a syringe from her bag, the liquid inside clear and odorless. Lily's showing concerning signs of her mother's weakness, crying during conditioning, failing to adapt to stress protocols. I've prepared a solution that will end her suffering quickly. Margaret explained her final protocol with clinical detachment. The injection contained a combination of drugs that would cause cardiac arrest, while leaving no obvious trace of murder. She'd used the same method on other failed subjects over the years, always managing to make their deaths appear natural. "The genetic line must remain pure," she continued. "Defective offspring dilute the bloodline and produce inferior generations. Your maternal genetics have contaminated this child beyond repair." The kitchen knife block was 3 steps away. I grabbed the largest blade and held it between us. "Stay away from my daughter," Margaret smiled. "You prove my point perfectly. Weak genetics produce irrational responses. A genetically superior mother would understand the necessity of eliminating flawed offspring." She showed me photos from her journal, other mothers who'd fought to protect their children from her genetic testing. Margaret had documented their resistance as further proof of genetic inferiority, justification for eliminating entire family lines. "Your behavior is textbook maternal hysteria," she said, advancing slowly. "The inability to accept genetic reality. David inherited his father's superior traits, which is why he understands the necessity of what I do." She lunged forward with the syringe. I slashed blindly with the knife, catching her wrist and sending the weapon clattering across the floor. Margaret's military training kicked in. She disarmed me in seconds, pinning me against the counter with professional efficiency. "David!" I screamed, hoping he would hear from upstairs. "Help us!" Margaret pressed her hand over my mouth. "David believes in my methods. He won't interfere with necessary genetic selection." She retrieved the syringe and advanced toward Lily, who lay crying in her carrier. This is for the good of the family bloodline. Weak children become weak adults who dilute genetic potential. David appeared in the doorway just as Margaret raised the syringe above Lily. For one terrible moment, I thought he might let her proceed. His face showed the internal conflict between decades of conditioning and paternal instinct. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice strange and distant. Margaret's expression remained calm, professional. "Completing the genetic evaluation. The subject has failed to meet minimum standards. Termination is required to preserve bloodline integrity. This is my daughter," David said quietly. "My child." "A defective child that will produce defective offspring," Margaret replied. "You understand the necessity, David. I taught you about genetic superiority when you were young." For a moment, David's programming almost won. I could see him wavering. Torn between love for his daughter and lifelong conditioning to trust his mother's judgment, Margaret had spent decades teaching him that weakness must be eliminated, that genetic purity justified any action. Then something in his expression shifted, and he tackled his mother from behind. The syringe flew across the room as they crashed into the refrigerator. Margaret fought with vicious efficiency, using pressure points and nerve strikes against her own son. But David was younger and stronger, and desperation gave him power his military training couldn't match. I called 911 while David held his mother on the kitchen floor. The operator stayed on the line as I explained about attempted murder, about decades of genetic experiments, about a grandmother trying to kill her own granddaughter to preserve genetic purity. Margaret continued lecturing even while restrained. She explained her theories about genetic optimization, the necessity of eliminating inferior bloodlines, the scientific basis for selective breeding in human populations. Her words chilled the 911 operator, who dispatched additional units to handle what she was describing as a domestic terrorism incident. When the police arrived, they found Margaret still struggling against David's restraint, demanding he release her so she could complete her genetic optimization protocol. The syringe contained a lethal dose of potassium chloride, enough to stop Lily's heart in seconds. The initial arrest was just the beginning. Margaret's house contained a laboratory that looked like something from a Nazi medical facility, detailed records of genetic experiments on dozens of children, equipment for conducting environmental stress tests, chemical compounds for inducing cardiac arrest and organ failure. The investigation uncovered the full scope of Margaret's crimes. 23 children over 4 decades, all subjected to her training protocols. 12 had died from the conditioning, their deaths ruled as accidents or genetic defects. The survivors showed varying degrees of physical and psychological damage. FBI agents found Margaret's complete genetic database, DNA samples from all her subjects, detailed family histories, breeding charts showing which bloodlines she considered superior. She'd been conducting a private eugenics program for decades, using her military credentials and professional network to access vulnerable children. The scope of the conspiracy extended beyond Margaret. She'd cultivated relationships with other military personnel, medical professionals, and child welfare workers who shared her beliefs about genetic superiority. Together, they'd identified and targeted families for genetic optimization programs. Margaret confessed to everything during interrogation, genuinely believing she'd performed a service by eliminating genetically inferior children. She showed no remorse for the deaths, only frustration that her research had been interrupted before reaching its full potential. "Genetic purification is a multi-generational project," she told investigators. "I was laying the groundwork for a superior human subspecies. The weak children who died were necessary sacrifices for evolutionary advancement." The confession revealed the full horror of her philosophy. Margaret believed that most humans were genetically defective, and that only extreme selection pressure could identify and preserve superior traits. She saw herself as a visionary scientist working toward human genetic perfection. At trial, she represented herself, using the courtroom as a platform to explain her eugenic theories. The judge cut her off repeatedly, but Margaret continued lecturing about genetic superiority and selective breeding until she was removed from the courtroom. David testified against his mother, describing years of conditioning that had shaped his understanding of strength and weakness. He genuinely believed her methods were beneficial, until seeing them applied to Lily made him recognize the systematic abuse he'd endured. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, medical records showing patterns of abuse across multiple families, video footage of Margaret's training sessions, her own journals documenting decades of genetic experiments, testimony from survivors who'd escaped her programs. The defense couldn't mount any meaningful response. Margaret's own words condemned her. Her methods were clearly criminal, and the evidence of systematic child murder was undeniable. The jury took less than an hour to find her guilty on all charges: multiple counts of child endangerment, 3 counts of murder, attempted murder of Lily, and conspiracy to commit genetic genocide. The judge sentenced her to life without parole, calling her crimes some of the most heinous acts of child abuse he'd ever encountered. As they led Margaret away, she looked directly at me and mouthed, "The weak will always destroy themselves." Even in defeat, she remained convinced of her twisted ideology, certain that genetic inferiority would ultimately lead to humanity's downfall. The aftermath shattered our family completely. David struggled with guilt over enabling his mother's crimes, over not protecting Rachel and Michael, over nearly losing Lily to the same madness that had claimed so many others. He'd been both victim and unwitting accomplice in Margaret's genetic selection program. We moved across the country to start fresh, far from the shadow of Margaret's influence. David changed his name, cutting all ties with the family that had covered up decades of genetic experiments. He started intensive therapy to process the abuse he'd normalized, the siblings he'd failed to protect. Michael reconnected with us after Margaret's arrest, finally free to speak about his experiences without fear of retaliation. He'd spent years in therapy dealing with the trauma of Margaret's training and the guilt of surviving while others didn't. Together with David, they began rebuilding their relationship as fellow survivors. Rachel remained in care, her brain damage too severe to reverse. But we visited her regularly, and she seemed to understand that the special exercises had finally ended. She smiled more often, laughed at simple jokes, found peace in activities that Margaret had never allowed her to enjoy. The investigation into Margaret's network continued for years. Other perpetrators were identified and prosecuted. Children who'd been subjected to similar programs received counseling and medical care. The conspiracy was larger than anyone had initially realized, touching multiple military bases and communities. Lily grew up healthy and normal, with no memory of those early months. But I never forgot how close we came to losing her to a monster who wore the mask of a loving grandmother. Every milestone of Lily's development felt like a victory over Margaret's genetic determinism. The survivors of Margaret's programs formed a support network, helping each other process the trauma and prevent similar abuses from occurring. We shared resources, monitored for warning signs, and educated professionals about recognizing genetic supremacist ideologies disguised as child development. 6 months later, Margaret died in prison after being attacked by inmates who learned about her crimes against children. Her death brought no satisfaction, only relief that she could never hurt another child. The monster was finally gone, but the damage she'd inflicted would echo through generations of survivors she'd left broken in her wake.